Welcome to One Book, readers discussing one book in their lives. This evening, well, this morning in California time, right, Melissa? We're
Yep.
discussing Albert Camus' novel, The Plague, published in 1947. Thank you for taking a little time out of your pandemic to talk about this novel with me, Melissa. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited to talk with you and to be included amongst your esteemed list of, creatives and talented artists. So thanks for the opportunity.
Well, I was thinking today that the French title of the novel, which is, I'll probably butcher the pronunciation, La Peste, it seems a little more fitting for our times because, of course, COVID is a pandemic, but it's also so annoying because we don't know so
Yeah.
much about it and like different countries, it's all over the world, but it's this little virus that's going in or out or around masks and changes all the time. But I really wanted to talk to you about this book because it seems almost too perfect that we can have this conversation. Not only
Yeah.
discussing a great novel by a Nobel Prize winner, but also during a pandemic, which
Yeah.
seems somehow perfect. And so I just wanted to start with, even in this time, found it difficult to keep up with reading, but I felt drawn to the plague. And so I'm curious about your rereading of it, or how you kind of came to the shelf to pull it down. What was the impetus?
Yeah. So I've been on a nonfiction kick for a while. And when I say a while, I think I've read like one work of fiction in the past 2 years. So um, I had wanted to break out of that. And it had been, 10 years since I read The Plague for the first time. And it's cliche, of course, to be like, oh, I want to read this to kind of glean insights and draw any comparisons and parallels. But I'm really glad that I did. And so yeah, it was just kind of seeking some type of anchor in art and literature,
Wow.
and knowing that this would kind of itch that scratch.
Wow, that's a great word, anchor. And I thought it was interesting that so many people were watching Outbreak and Contagion,
Yeah.
which I didn't do, but I did read The Plague, and it was something about at this time also needed to talk about it. But
Hmm.
it's unlikely that you run into someone in your house who happened to read it. So I really
Yeah.
appreciate this time. So what you said you had read it 10 years ago. What did you kind of get drawn to in this reading, whether because of this pandemic situation or just being older or reading in another time, that was different? And how maybe did it read you back differently this time around?
Well, I think that first of all, the first time that I read it, the idea of living through a pandemic just seemed so far removed. Like,
Yeah.
in, you know, despite the fact that, 10 years ago, there was still a lot of chaos and a lot of shit wrong with the world, the idea that this, with modern medicine and just everything that we would
Mm-hmm.
be experiencing, something that he's like articulates so well. So that I think, kind of viewing something as a global pandemic conceptually as like a literary device and a metaphor for life 10
Right.
years ago, as opposed to this felt more like reading someone's diary and more like like a
Yeah.
very documentarian type of like work.
Yeah.
um and yeah, like you mentioned, in 10 years, just different life experiences have shifted my outlook and the way that I think of things, and have really kind of cemented my existential, thought and philosophy. So reading that was a kind of another different element in reading it in 2020 as opposed to, when you and I were working together.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one thing that jumped out that I'm sure I didn't think about the first few times I read it, over the decades, was there's a beautifully written long paragraph attaching the what's happening in Iran to a tradition, almost a tradition of plagues that they talk about, like Constantinople and the Black Death. But what really struck me was though of course we're told, oh, it was bound to happen, or air travel, and we have coronaviruses all over the place all the time, and there was Ebola not too long ago. But it seems very different that we don't have this kind of connection in history because it's so new and everyone's going through it simultaneously. And
Yeah.
that struck me as very interesting, that I would not have thought of before without living it. And then the fact that the town seemed to lack information, even though they knew what was coming, because they had this kind of,
Hmm.
they were another link in the chain of these kinds of plagues passed through fleas and rats. But we seem to have an abundance of information. It may be
Yeah.
okay in San Francisco this morning, but then you read that LA is going back to shutting a lot of stuff down. Or I was just reading about Hong Kong cases are going up, and then there's so many different people talking about what to do and so there's a whole different level of anxiety brought on by a kind of hyper information. I don't
Yeah.
know if you noticed that in reading it.
Yeah, no, and at the risk of oversharing, this is something that I've talked with my therapist about like ad nauseum. I
Interesting.
think that she would feel a lot better about my emotional state if I didn't have Twitter, uh, because it's just so easy to just be completely consumed and
Yes.
engrossed. And I
Yeah.
think that in the beginning, particularly in March when New York was so hard hit, I found myself just, you know, constantly on Twitter, constantly on Reddit, reading about,
Mm-hmm.
what was going on there. At one point, I had like a hospital bag because someone said that that would have been helpful. They ended up being hospitalized. And, but yeah, I think that in terms of the amount of inundation that we constantly have with information adds another level of complexity because close to half of the information that you're getting is probably inaccurate or skewed. And
Yeah.
but it's on all fronts. It's really unrelentless.
Yeah, that's like when you one of the things that is so clear in the book about that when the gates shut and the town is isolated, like we're not isolated, but we're in our house. And I guess we were
Yeah.
isolated during lockdown, but even then we weren't as isolated as the. So while it's historically connected, what really struck me was how unique these circumstances are, to the point of just almost like out of a bad movie or something. But
Hmm.
you'll appreciate this. I think I don't think I ever read it. Certain things jump out at you at different times, and I wanted to quote something that jumped out to you because there's beautiful evocation of the separation of loved ones, husbands, wives, children, fathers that are stuck outside of the city, and here I am, um, you know, separated from my fiance, and I don't know when I'll see her. She's in another country, and the borders are closed right now. And it was so powerful to read this, though I had read it before, and you remember the plot, and certain scenes certainly stick out. But I had never encountered myself on the page before in a way, reading this novel like I did because of what we're going through. And he talks about how, I'll just quote it to you. He's talking about how couples are parting on the train station, like a few weeks before the plague broke out. And he talks about, they kissed one another goodbye on the platform and exchanged a few trivial remarks, sure as they were of seeing one another again after a few days, or at most a few weeks, duped by our blind faith in the near future. And that phrase, blind faith in the near future, it went through my heart like a stake.
Yeah.
Because the last
Yeah.
time I saw my fiance, it was the kiss goodbye, I'll see you soon, and then the taxi drove away. And I know literature can do this, but to be able to capture that in such a crazy time right now that we've kind of never lived through and maybe never will again, but there it is. That it just goes
Yeah.
to show you, literature like this makes us realize we're not alone in a very profound way. And I didn't know if there was one part that jumped out like you, like for you, like that in this reading.
Mhm. Yeah, I have long held on to a quote by Camus, and I had forgotten that its origin was in the plague until I reread it. But it's one of the it's a quote by him that I think really does justice to existentialism and absurdism. I think that it's oftentimes easy for people to look at writers like Sartre or Camus or Kierkegaard and be like, oh, they're existentials, they're
Right.
dark,
Yeah.
Simone de Beauvoir, like
Yeah.
you're an existentialist, like
Uh,
you're just really depressed and negative.
yeah.
But the quote is, him, I think it's Dr. Ryu that says this, like how deprived it must be living with only what one knows and what remembers, removed from what hopes for. And
Yeah.
I
Mm.
think that that rereading that, really one of the things that I have always appreciated about existentialism is the freedom that kind of accompanies, relinquishing attachment to controlling everything and just kind of finding freedom in the fact that life is randomly absurd and something like the plague is indiscriminate in who it takes and things like that. And so, I have always found comfort in books like The Stranger and The Plague, because I think that if you dig a little bit more deeply, there is a message of hope and love. Um, and I think that too, one other thing that struck me more in the second reading most recently was um, just the humanism within certain characters compared with, say, like the Jesuit priest who in the first sermon that he gives is just
Right.
basically like saying, this is punishment, God is punishing all
Yeah.
of you because you're shitty humans and you suck and this is your fault.
Yeah.
Whereas, the atheists, those that do not, have like decoupled themselves from like an entity or deity, are like the most humanistic characters in the book. So
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's kind of it's a tough label because even Camus toward the end didn't consider himself strictly an existentialist or even an absurdist, but it's often used to kind of keep the book away. But one of the most profound things reading it now this time around was what you're talking about, which is a call to action. And that
yeah.
I don't want to try to give away too much for the ending if but there's the character Taru, which I may be butchering his name as well. But he talks about people, unable to be saints, but refusing to bow down to the pestilence and try to strive their utmost against suffering. And that is such a profound thing now because checking in on a neighbor or visiting your friends and having coffee or skyping someone from around the world, these can be profound acts right now, and
Yeah.
it may get worse. And so this notion of action that propels the characters, some of them, to deal with the circumstances was something I found inspiring.
Hmm.
Probably more so than just reading it in the confines of a quote unquote normal life, which I don't know if I remember that well too much anymore.
Yeah. It seems kind of far off. But yeah, certainly a different weight, I think, on reading this as again, it felt more of a chronicle, more personal, more like a diary, as opposed to just, you know, so reading something like the Upton Sinclair's like The Jungle, like you're able to put yourself like back in that and
Yes.
kind of like empathize with the experience of like people in Chicago working in meatpacking industries. And I feel like I went through, that's how I read The Plague the first time. It was like, oh, well, yeah, it was the early 20th century. Everyone was dirty. Of course they had a
Yeah,
plague.
yeah, of course, yeah,
Just
of
the
course.
hope be best. We have
Well,
Purell. We're
yeah,
good. Like
yeah.
we have antibiotics.
Well, I'm curious about the other thing that jumped out at me was that he talks about in reference to the lovers how, but I think it applies to anybody right now, especially that we're so isolated in some form of, not traveling as much or not going out or nowhere to go. But he talks about this notions of the shortcomings, and I swear everyone examining their shortcomings of how they've approached their relationships. And I've had those times like you can't sleep and you're like reflecting on things that you wish you would have done different. And also this notion of the tokens. He talks about people going looking through the house, finding one postcard that they received a year ago. And I think we're doing the
Mhm.
same thing, going through texts or going through emails, connecting with people we haven't talked with before in recently, but were important to us in our path so far. Uh, uh,
Mhm.
did you experience some of those things as well? I guess upon reading the book and in your daily life right now in the pandemic times.
Um, yeah, I think that this has brought the fragility and mortality of the human race. It's occupying just a little bit of headspace with me lately.
Yeah.
Um, and also just seeing, kind of, this is going to sound really bleak, but like the milestones that we have like just continued to surpass. So like when
Yes.
we reached the milestone of, oh, this is how many troops were killed in the Vietnam War, and now we're now at like triple that.
Yes.
That I think that we can become really desensitized to that. So um that's one thing that I tried to be cognizant of. And yeah, it has made me, you know, you know, I'm more frequently in touch with certain friends and family, and you know, just more aware. I think is what I'll say around like those relationships and maintaining them.
Well, speaking of, I don't know how much you were struck with Grand reading through this time around, but he seemed to leap off the page to me at that
Yeah,
manuscript, and I don't know why I didn't pay so much attention to it before because it's not
yeah,
like it was a tiny part, but I think parts of the novel on first readings or maybe now because we're kind of shaped differently and it's reading us back in a different way, but I had never given as much thought to Grand now. So I want to ask you this. So he's writing this you think it's a manuscript, and there's that awful scene when Rue comes up to him and sees him in the Christmas window, and he's remembering
uh-huh.
the time that he was young with his wife, and then the marriage. He crucifies himself on remembering how he did not become a fulfilling partner, and she left, and he's staring at the window, and then you find out when he's sick that the manuscript was just alternate versions of the same sentence, pretty much.
Yeah,
And then
yeah,
he's like, he thinks he's gonna die. It's such a power.
yeah.
Camus is such a good writer, and he's like, burn it,
He
burn it,
is.
burn it. And so they burned the manuscript. And then this is my question. He lives and surprises
Yeah,
everybody, but this is my
yeah,
question. So he then is healthy and he says, I'm going to start the manuscript again. And the reason I bring
yeah,
this up is so many of us now are thinking about how can we better ourselves, or people are starting businesses, projects. I've started my own, and I'm just like, how do you read that? Like, was it
yeah,
ultimately inspiring that he's going to start that again, or is it he's putting the chains back on? You know, it
yeah.
was a very, very, very ambiguous.
Yeah. It's funny that you bring up Grant because the way that I reread that, or the way that it resonated in his experiences, uh, the way in which I experienced them this time around was very similar to that exercise that a lot of us are going through. Like, oh, I'm going to take this opportunity to learn French, or I'm
Yeah,
going to get in shape. It's just like
yeah,
trying to have like some type of purpose, so that it feels like we want to have something to show for this time once it's all done and said and over. But an additional layer of that is just, I think, his, you know brush with death,
hmm,
surviving the plague. I think that, again, what harkening back to that message of hope, maybe he's just this feeling renewed and more inspired, and that was the block. That was the removal of the block that he needed
yeah,
to get through. It
yeah.
was a catalyst, so to speak.
And he did end up writing his wife
Yeah,
after all those years. Yeah, but he's
yeah,
I think I saw it. Maybe you had alluded to this earlier when you talked about it as a, I don't know, a literary trope. Let's set all these characters in a plague, and as you're reading it from the outside, so to speak, it maybe you don't have as much empathy for the characters as you do when now you are very familiar with the milestones which are talked about in the novel, or
Yeah.
you see the characters in a way. That's why I really encourage people to read it or reread it. But I was also struck, and I don't know why I didn't remember this as much the first time, but the asthma patient who seems to have asthma through the whole plague. And at the end,
Yeah.
he pronounces one of the most powerful thoughts that you had already talked about when he asks him. I mean, he says something to the effect of, I think I wrote it down here, but, the plague, what is it? It's just life. Right? It's like, and and obviously that was powerful when I encountered it at first as a way into the novel. But now with all of the, um, I think I'm thinking about plagues in a more complex way after reading it
Hmm.
this time. The plague of racism, the plague of marginalization, and obviously we know poverty's wrong. The real plague that the wealth gap is introducing and how it's robbing not only the victims of so much, but all of us of so much that we can all contribute. Because one of the things that comes through in this novel is people wanting to contribute, volunteer against this plague, that ails us all, which is life. And so I was really aware of this kind of a more fluid definition of how we can think of plague other than a metaphor for X or life, but all of these
Hmm.
plagues that ail us. And since you're in the U.S., I was wondering if you had a similar experience, especially with these social justice issues, Black Lives Matter, a lot of these of the police brutality concerns going on, and how we're plagued by plagues.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and thinking about when the plague was, when he started writing it and when it was ultimately published, like by this point, you know, I feel like we've been through a lot recently. But think of like mid 20th century, like
Yep.
two world wars, concentration camps, the introduction of, atomic energy into, wars. Like by this point, people had seen and been introduced to some crazy and wild shit.
Well
And that,
said. Well said.
yeah.
Yeah.
And now looking at like 2020, we're now almost 2 decades into like the longest running war in American history, with like
Mm-hmm.
occupation of places in the Middle East, and you know drones, cyber terrorism. Like there's yeah, once again, there's a lot of shit going on. And then you have these like microcosms, like these like micro plagues. And then you have something that is, again, indiscriminate in who it impacts, with like an actual global pandemic. Um, and it was, I think, as a sociology nerd, part of me is just really fascinated with the volatility of things that are going on in the U.S. landscape right now. And I think that, a lot of it is promising. Now, with that being said, it's still, that volatility still has like consequences and pain behind it. I mean, to lose, like, even this week, like two American civil rights leaders, like on the same
Yeah.
day, with all of this
Yes.
uh, discourse that's going on. It's just it's a lot. It's just it's sometimes difficult to put into words, like what witnessing it is like. Um, but yeah, I think that, at the plague, the end of the book, like even in the final sentences, Dr. Ryu's reflecting on, his like humanist side, and he has some touching and like tender thoughts. And then he's
Mm-hmm.
like, and then it basically, Camus wraps up with like, and then Ryu remembers that bacillus can lie dormant for years and years and years. Another plague is going to hit. And then
Yep.
that's pretty much how the book ends. Um, and so I think that what I'm like cautiously optimistic about is that at the end of this, that there is some good change that comes about, either in the manner in which we conduct ourselves individually on a day-to-day basis, thinking, being more community oriented, being more
Hmm.
collectively oriented. There are definitely lessons that can be learned, and I hope that we have the wisdom to learn them.
Well, I really liked what you said, bringing up the rather blood-soaked 20th century, which often we forget was horrific, with millions and millions, millions of victims of just horrific circumstances. And there's something about, reading the plague, it makes these things less abstract. That's one of the dialogues in the book. Rio even talks about it, the abstract versus something you experience. And yeah, we were aware of World War II. We've studied the Holocaust. We studied the civil rights movement. But there's something about, in the same way that when we read the plague, we're placed in that space, but now we are literally in that space where these things become more conscious in our minds.
Mm-hmm.
We can touch them and taste them and feel them in ways that we haven't. And maybe that was a shortcoming before. Maybe that was just a product of what the quote I had mentioned was, what a faith in the near future, that it was just going to be pretty calm. So I think that is optimistic, and you do see the community connections that whether that are the community values that are upheld in the book, people trying to come together. I was a little jealous that they could leave their house and still go to the cinema, and they could go
Yeah.
to they could go to the dances and have plays and see
Yeah.
theater.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and there's some parts in there where, Dr. Ryu would, wrap up his day just being totally, subjected to like death and plague, and he'd be like, all right, let's go to the cafe and have a drink. And I
Yes,
like, and that same like part of me that is infuriated by seeing like commercials for Applebee's telling people to come in and dine. I'm like, why are you going to a bar right now? You can't be doing that.
right.
Um, but uh, yeah, there is, and like you said, Camus is just such a beautiful writer, and there's just some eloquence and romanticism around being in, mid 20th century Algeria, like Northern Africa, cobblestone streets, smoking cigarettes, drinking, and all against the backdrop of a pandemic with dead rats in the street.
Yeah,
He is such a good writer.
yeah, and I think some of the best writing you encounter in the plague we have to talk about it, even though it's hard. Is that very famous scene of the boy who is struggling with plague symptoms and fighting for his life, and it's the description of him ultimately succumbing in this horrible way, and all of the characters gathered around, and there's the choir of the other children in the hospital also screaming out in pain. And it's such a, I mean, that has, it's such a powerful few pages that I didn't
Yeah.
recover it from the first time, and reading it now was it sears empathy into your body, the way he describes them. I think he called them like a tortured on the crucifix, and it's the ultimate existential issue of people around us, at any time
Yeah.
can suffer like this. So that's an important thing to know. As multiple characters say in the book, I think it's Taru, when he's asked, "How did you learn so much?" and he says, "Through suffering."
Yeah. Yeah. Well, even that, I agree with you. I think that that is probably one of the more, it's really well written, but it's really difficult to read.
Mm-hmm.
It's just so detailed, and just having that be a collective experience, both for, because that boy's parents, I think one of them was like a magistrate who was like
Yes,
super conservative, and
yes,
just
yes, and
and then
he wasn't even there.
yeah.
He was quarantined at the time, which is what's happening to a lot of our fellow citizens right now, separated if one person is sick. He was
Yeah.
quarantined, so everyone else is around watching. Yeah.
Yeah. And having it even be like the Jesuit priest being there, and having that be like kind of a catalyst for him,
Yes.
and even slightly shifting like his thinking from like a punitive how can you look at a child that's suffering this
Mm-hmm.
much and ultimately succumbs to plague and say that that child is, brought that down on himself. And um,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's an important passage in the book for sure. A really gripping passage.
Yeah, and well, I think we're running out of time, but I think we can end with Dr. Ryu's words when he talks about, it's revealed that he is the narrator, and
Hmm.
he is this character who moves from the abstract to connecting with moral empathy in a different way, and he talks about why he wrote the manuscript. The narrator says, and he says, for some memorial of the injustice and outrage done to them might endure, so that this chronicle, and it's amazing that you said it reads now like a chronicle, whereas before it read more of obviously like a work of fiction, but that this chronicle is left to, so something may endure from the suffering and the chaos and the upheaval. And that's ultimately, to me, that's the only answer.
Yeah. Well, and again, it did, like, even I think that for those of us that know Camus well, and have know his work well, that you see Camus in Ryu,
Mm-hmm.
and some of his like tenets and aspects of his moral compass, and that's something, gratitude was something that I definitely felt in rereading this. It was a really good exercise for me. Um, because again, it was just, it's always been a gift. It's been a gift since it was published, but now it's just, it should be mandatory required reading for everyone. It's, he really did, it really was a manuscript. I don't, maybe he didn't see it kind of coming to fruition in this exact way, but it's just so applicable and relevant today. So
Well, that's perfectly said. So we're going to end it there and encourage people to read or reread The Plague by
yeah,
Albert Camus. I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your morning, and
no,
wish you continued safety. And I hope everything goes smooth in California and everywhere else. And just hope you stay safe. And thank you so much for your time today.
yeah, no, I really appreciate talking with you about this, and I hope that you're recoupled and partnered again soon.
Yes, yes. And if you're new to the channel, please remember to subscribe, and you can share it with friends and like the video. And until next time.